April 1953. Spring came late to the mountains of Gangwon Province, where the Korean War had settled into a brutal stalemate after 3 years of fighting that had devastated the peninsula and killed millions. North Korean intelligence officer Ahn Hak-seop, just 23 years old, moved carefully through enemy territory behind South Korean lines, part of a six-man reconnaissance unit tasked with gathering intelligence and supporting North Korean detachments. His unit had been decimated by constant combat, attrition wearing them down one man at a time until only Ahn remained. He wore the uniform of the Korean People's Army, serving what he believed was a just cause: the liberation of his homeland from American imperialism and the reunification of Korea under communist rule. But on that April day, just 3 months before the armistice that would freeze the conflict in place for decades, South Korean troops captured him. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary and tragic stories of the Korean War. 42 years of imprisonment, torture, and unbreakable resistance. A lifetime spent in concrete cells because Ahn Hak-seop refused to sign a single piece of paper renouncing his beliefs. Ahn Hak-seop was born in 1930 on Gangwon Island, a strategic location near what would become the border between North and South Korea, though no such division existed then. Korea at that time was under brutal Japanese colonial rule, a condition that had persisted since 1910 when Japan annexed the peninsula and systematically attempted to erase Korean culture, language, and identity. Ahn grew up in a world where speaking Korean in public could bring punishment, where Korean names were forcibly changed to Japanese, and where young Korean men were conscripted into Japanese labor battalions or military service. His childhood was shaped by occupation, resistance, and the dream of liberation that sustained the Korean people through decades of oppression. When World War II ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender, Korea was finally free from colonial rule. But liberation did not bring the independence Koreans had fought for. Instead, the victorious Allied powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, divided the peninsula along the 38th parallel as a temporary administrative measure while they decided Korea's fate. The division was meant to last only until free elections could be held, but as Cold War tensions escalated between the superpowers, the temporary line hardened into a permanent border. The Soviet Union established a communist government in the north under Kim Il-sung, while the United States backed an anti-communist regime in the south under Syngman Rhee. For Ahn, who was 15 when the war ended, the division meant his homeland was still not truly free, merely traded one form of foreign domination for another. In the years following liberation, Ahn witnessed the violent suppression of left-wing movements in the South. People's committees, grassroots organizations formed to govern locally after Japanese administrators fled, were crushed by American military forces and South Korean police. There was widespread resistance to the American occupation and the Syngman Rhee government, which many saw as composed of collaborators who had served the Japanese colonial administration. Ahn became involved in these underground movements, joining the Communist Youth League while studying in Kaesong, a city that would later end up in North Korea but was then under South Korean control. He participated in clandestine activities aimed at undermining the American presence and the Rhee government, distributing propaganda, organizing workers, and evading police. This underground activism was dangerous work. Ahn had multiple run-ins with South Korean police and spent time in hiding, sleeping under bushes and pine trees to avoid arrest. On August 8, 1947, while returning from a meeting to plan celebrations for Liberation Day, someone shot at Ahn and his colleague. His friend was wounded and arrested. Ahn escaped and went further underground, eventually fleeing to the northern part of Korea. These experiences, the repression, the violence, the desperate resistance, shaped his worldview and deepened his commitment to the communist cause, which he saw as Korea's path to genuine independence and social justice. When the Korean War erupted on June 25, 1950, with North Korea's invasion of the South, Ahn was 20 years old. He enlisted in the Korean People's Army, viewing the war as a liberation struggle to reunify the country and drive out American imperialism. Initially delayed from combat duty due to illness, He eventually joined as an intelligence officer, assigned to gather information and support KPA operations behind enemy lines. This was specialized and dangerous work, requiring him to move through territory controlled by South Korean and American forces, coordinating with underground communist networks and reporting on enemy positions and movements. On served during some of the war's most brutal phases. He remembered the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in late 1950, where Chinese forces intervened massively to save North Korea from defeat, suffering catastrophic casualties in bitter winter conditions. He helped transfer wounded Chinese volunteers to hospitals, witnessing firsthand the enormous human cost of the war. By 1951, he had formally joined the KPA as second-in-command of Platoon 941, directly subordinate to Army Unit 52, a six-man reconnaissance team operating deep in enemy territory. Their mission was to move supplies from the north to KPA detachments fighting in the south, a logistical lifeline for communist forces operating behind the front lines. By April 1953, 3 years of grinding warfare had taken their toll on Ahn's unit. Attrition had reduced the six-man team to just one. Ahn himself, the sole survivor of countless close calls and combat encounters. The war had reached a stalemate, with armistice negotiations dragging on for months as both sides fought to improve their positions before the ceasefire. Ahn was on his way to a Workers' Party meeting in Gangwon province when South Korean troops spotted and captured him. He was wearing his KPA uniform at the time of capture, a fact that would become crucial to his later arguments that he should have been treated as a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. Instead of being processed as a POW who would be repatriated after the war, Ahn was accused of espionage. South Korean authorities claimed that because he had been operating in civilian areas gathering intelligence rather than fighting on the front lines, he was a spy rather than a soldier. This classification allowed them to try him in civilian court and sentence him to life imprisonment. It was a legal fiction designed to keep valuable prisoners out of the POW exchange that would follow the armistice. Thousands of prisoners were repatriated in 1953, but Ahn and others like him were deliberately excluded. What followed was a nightmare that would last more than 4 decades. Ahn was subjected to intense interrogation and torture designed to break his will and force him to renounce communism. South Korea operated an ideological conversion program for political prisoners, a systematic effort to extract written confessions and oaths renouncing communist beliefs and pledging loyalty to the South Korean state. Prisoners who converted received better treatment, reduced sentences, and eventual release. Those who refused were subjected to brutal punishment and indefinite detention. The torture Ahn endured was systematic and savage. Interrogators placed him in an icy concrete cell, so small he could barely sit down, leaving him there for days or weeks at a time. They dislocated his arms repeatedly until the joints cracked and popped out of their sockets. He was whipped with knotted ropes that tore his skin, subjected to simulated drowning, and beaten on the soles of his bare feet with sticks until his toenails fell off. One particularly cruel technique involved pouring ice-cold water continuously on the top of his head. The sensation, he said, was like being struck with a rock, and it drove him to the brink of madness. Throughout all of this, his captors offered him a way out. Simply sign the conversion document, renounce communism, and he could resume a normal life. But Ahn refused. For him, signing would mean betraying everything he believed in, abandoning the cause he had risked his life for, and admitting that his comrades had died for nothing. His refusal was absolute, even when interrogators brought his mother and brother to the prison and tortured them in front of him, trying to use his love for his family to break his resistance. Even this he endured, though decades later he would say it was the most painful torture of all. Years turned into decades. Ahn remained imprisoned through the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, an entire lifetime spent behind bars. The world outside changed dramatically. The Korean War became history. South Korea transformed from a devastated, impoverished dictatorship into an economic powerhouse, and the Cold War raged and eventually ended. But Ahn's situation remained unchanged because his refusal to convert never wavered. He became one of a small group of unconverted long-term prisoners, men who had been captured during or shortly after the Korean War and who refused for decades to renounce their beliefs. The torture eventually stopped being constant, but the imprisonment continued. Ahn developed routines to survive, running in place in his cell, exercising to stay warm and maintain his strength, using judo techniques he had learned as a young man to keep his body functional despite the harsh conditions. But there were moments when even his iron will couldn't sustain him. He passed out from cold and deprivation multiple times, and guards had to drag his unconscious body out of the freezing cells to prevent him from dying. They wanted him alive. A dead prisoner couldn't be converted, but a living one might eventually break. In the late 1980s, South Korea underwent a democratic transition. The military dictatorships that had ruled since the Korean War gave way to elected civilian governments, and civil society began demanding accountability for past human rights abuses. Human rights organizations investigated the treatment of political prisoners and discovered systematic torture in South Korea's ideological conversion program. In 2004, a government panel reported that 77 inmates had died as a result of torture during the program. Another panel later officially recognized Ahn Hak-seop as a victim of torture. On August 15, 1995, Korean Independence Day, marking 50 years since liberation from Japan, Ahn was finally released as part of the special pardon. He had been imprisoned for 42 years and 4 months, from age 23 to age 65. He emerged into a world utterly transformed. The Soviet Union had collapsed, capitalism had swept the globe, and South Korea had become a wealthy, modern country. Seoul, which he remembered as a war-ravaged city, was now a sprawling metropolis of skyscrapers and advanced technology. He was an old man, his youth consumed by concrete cells and interrogation rooms, released into a society he barely recognized. Ahn's release came with conditions and surveillance. Though technically free, he remained under government watch as an unconverted communist in a fiercely anti-communist society. He was finally at liberty to walk the streets, but he had no family, no resources, and no place in this new world. At age 70, he married a woman 32 years his junior, companionship found late in life after decades of enforced solitude. His wife would later develop dementia and move in with relatives, leaving Ahn alone again. In 2000, the South Korean government organized a voluntary repatriation of dozens of former North Korean prisoners who wished to return to the DPRK. For Ahn, this was a moment of decision. He could return to North Korea, the country he had fought for and endured torture to defend. But he chose to stay in South Korea. His reasoning was both principled and stubborn. He felt he needed to remain in the South to continue defending his ideals, to serve as living testimony to the brutality of the South Korean system and the righteousness of the communist cause. It was a decision that would haunt him in his final years. Ahn connected with other activists and unconverted prisoners, forming a small community of people who shared his political beliefs and his experiences. He was legally adopted by the wife of Pastor Lee, a Christian pastor who ran the Mintongseong Peace Church, dedicated not to conventional worship, but to Korean reunification and anti-American activism. This adoption gave Ahn a family of sorts, and his adopted daughter created papier-mâché sculptures depicting America as an imperial power. One showed the Statue of Liberty armed with a rifle, smoking a cigar, with dollar bills protruding from her clothing. These sculptures filled Ahn's small home, physical manifestations of the ideology he had never abandoned. Now 95 years old, Ahn lives in Gimpo, a small village near the North Korean border, in an area so close to the DMZ that it requires military authorization to enter. His body is frail. He relies on a walking stick and moves with painful slowness, a shadow of the judo enthusiast he once was. He has lost consciousness multiple times in recent years, his aged body finally succumbing to decades of torture and deprivation. He knows he doesn't have much time left. Ahn's great regret is that he will die in South Korea rather than the North. "I've lost all affection for this country," he said in a 2025 interview. "I was born under colonial rule. I've suffered all kinds of human rights abuses, and even in death, I thought I'll be buried in colonial soil while my colleagues rest in the independent land of the North." He has made repeated requests to be allowed to return to North Korea before he dies, but the South Korean government has refused, citing security concerns and the fact that North Korea has not formally requested his repatriation. Ahn posted a message on his mailbox: "Withdraw U.S. troops. His condition for peace with the country that has imprisoned him." When asked about North Korea's human rights record, the prison camps, the totalitarian control, the generational punishment of dissidents, Ahn dismisses the criticism as lies. "People say North Korea is a dictatorship, but I feel that's all lies," he insists. He defends Kim Jong-un, the third-generation dictator of the DPRK. He's doing a good job. His views are shaped by a lifetime of commitment to an ideology that gave meaning to his suffering. To admit now that North Korea is oppressive would mean acknowledging that his 42 years of torture were for nothing, that he refused conversion in defense of a system as brutal as the one that tortured him. It's a cognitive dissonance he cannot afford at age 95 as he faces death. Ahn's story raises uncomfortable questions about belief, resistance, and the human cost of ideological conflict. Is his refusal to convert for 42 years an act of extraordinary courage and principle, or is it tragic stubbornness in defense of an indefensible system? Can both be true simultaneously? The South Korean government tortured him for decades, violating international law and basic human dignity. That brutality is documented and undeniable. But the North Korean system he defends has committed comparable atrocities against its own people. Ahn is both a victim and an ideologue, a man who suffered terribly for his beliefs and who continues to defend beliefs that have justified suffering. The Geneva Convention clearly states that prisoners of war must be repatriated at the end of hostilities. Ahn was captured in uniform, serving in a military unit 3 months before the armistice. By any reasonable interpretation, he should have been released in 1953 with the other POWs. The decision to classify him as a spy rather than a soldier was a legal maneuver designed to circumvent international law. His torture violated the Convention Against Torture and multiple other international human rights instruments. From a legal and human rights perspective, what was done to Ahn Hak-seop was clearly wrong. Yet Ahn's unwavering defense of North Korea, even in his 90s, complicates efforts to use his story as a simple narrative of victimization. He is not a dissident who suffered for freedom. He suffered for communism, for a totalitarian system that has created its own mountains of victims. His case became a cause célèbre for leftist activists in South Korea and internationally, cited as evidence of South Korean brutality and American imperialism. But those same activists often ignore or minimize North Korean human rights abuses that are equally well documented. Ahn himself seems untroubled by this contradiction, his worldview fixed decades ago and impervious to evidence that might challenge it. In August 2025, Ahn made another attempt to return to North Korea, petitioning the South Korean government to allow him to cross the border. He was one of 5 surviving unconverted prisoners seeking repatriation. The request was denied. North Korea, for its part, has shown little interest in repatriating these elderly men. They are politically inconvenient, reminders of a war the regime prefers to mythologize rather than remember in human terms. Ahn is trapped, unable to return to the country he fought for, unwilling to accept the country he lives in, waiting for death in a small village that is neither home nor exile, but some liminal space between. Ahn continues to give occasional interviews, his voice breaking when he speaks of the torture, his body still bearing the physical and psychological scars of 4 decades in prison. "When I talk about it, my heart pounds and I can't sleep," he admitted in 2025. The trauma remains fresh despite the passage of time, nightmares that haunt his final years. He speaks clearly about his beliefs, articulating a critique of South Korean capitalism and American influence that is coherent, if unpersuasive, to most listeners. North Korea is the birthplace of my ideology, he explained. Unlike socialism, the root of all problems is private ownership of the means of production. It only breeds greed. Here, the children of the rich live in luxury, while others have nothing. There is a tragic nobility in Ahn's refusal to convert, even as there is a tragic blindness in his continued defense of North Korea. He represents something increasingly rare in the modern world: a true believer, someone who held fast to his convictions despite enormous personal cost, who chose principles over comfort, ideology over survival. In an age of flexible commitments and situational ethics, Ahn's absolute refusal to compromise has a certain purity, even when the ideology he refuses to abandon is deeply problematic. He is a relic of the Cold War, a living fossil from an era when people believed so strongly in competing visions of the future that they were willing to endure decades of torture rather than betray those visions. As Ahn approaches his 100th year, his final wish remains unfulfilled. He wants to die in North Korea, to be buried in independent land rather than what he views as American colonial soil. It is unlikely this wish will be granted. The South Korean government has no incentive to allow an unconverted communist prisoner to return to the North, where his story could be used for propaganda purposes. North Korea, meanwhile, has not requested his repatriation and seems content to let him remain where he is. Ahn will almost certainly die in Gimpo, in that small village near the border, tantalizingly close to the country he fought for but forever unable to return. His body is failing. The years of torture, the decades of imprisonment, the accumulated damage of a life lived under extraordinary hardship. He moves slowly, leaning heavily on his cane, his once strong frame reduced to fragility. His mind remains sharp, his beliefs unshaken, but his time is running out. When he dies, one of the last living links to the Korean War will be gone, and with him a story that encapsulates the human cost of ideological conflict. Ahn Hak-seop spent 42 years in prison for refusing to sign a piece of paper. Think about that for a moment. 42 years, more than half a typical lifespan, confined to concrete cells and subjected to systematic torture, all because he would not write his name on a document renouncing beliefs he held sacred. The sheer force of will required to maintain that refusal for 4 decades is almost incomprehensible. Most people would break in days or weeks under such conditions. Ahn lasted 42 years and never broke. Whether his resistance was heroic or foolish, principled or stubborn, admirable or tragic, depends on perspective. To South Korean conservatives, he is a dangerous communist who received just punishment for his treasonous beliefs. To South Korean progressives and human rights activists, he is a victim of state torture and a reminder of the country's authoritarian past. To North Korean sympathizers, he is a hero who endured unimaginable suffering rather than betray the socialist cause. To anti-communists, he is a cautionary tale about the dangers of ideological fanaticism. All of these interpretations capture some aspect of the truth, but none captures it completely. What is indisputable is that Ahn Hak-seop's life was stolen from him. From age 23 to 65, the years when most people build careers, raise families, create lives, he sat in prison cells, his youth and middle age consumed by a system that demanded ideological conformity as the price of freedom. That 42 years can never be returned. The family he might have had, the life he might have lived, the person he might have become without torture and imprisonment, all of that is lost forever. In that sense, Ahn is a victim regardless of the rightness or wrongness of his beliefs. At 95, Ahn Hak-seop sits in his small home surrounded by anti-American sculptures, wearing his felt hat, leaning on his walking stick, waiting for death and hoping it will come in North Korea. He has outlived his captors, outlived most of his comrades, outlived the Cold War that defined his life. He has witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union, the transformation of China, the end of the ideological conflict that once seemed eternal. But his own beliefs have not changed. He remains what he was at 23, a committed communist, a believer in the cause, a man who will die as he lived, refusing to convert. His story is a testament to human endurance and human obstinacy, to the power of belief and the danger of unexamined ideology, to the brutality of torture and the tragedy of wasted lives. Ahn Hak-seop, the prisoner who never confessed, the soldier who never surrendered, the believer who never converted, stands as one of the last living monuments to the Korean War and the Cold War era that followed. When he dies, whether in Gimpo or impossibly in Pyongyang, a chapter of history will close. His 42 years in solitary and tortured imprisonment will become a footnote, a statistic, a historical curiosity. But for Ahn himself, those years were his life, the only life he had, spent in suffering for beliefs he held more precious than freedom, more important than comfort, more valuable than life itself.